The Velthari had a saying: when something smells like a trap, it probably is, and when it smells like nothing at all, it's definitely a human. That particular wisdom came later, of course. At the time, when the long-range drones of the Velthari Outer Survey Fleet first picked up the distress signature drifting somewhere between the Cassian corridor and absolutely nowhere useful, none of them were thinking about traps. They were thinking about paperwork. Specifically, how much paperwork would be generated by ignoring a distress signal versus responding to one. Fleet Commander Orvan Death Solis, a tall, gray-scaled being with four-lidded eyes and the permanent expression of someone who had just bitten into something sour, ran the numbers in his head and sighed through all three of his breathing slits. "Pull it in," he said, because the paperwork for ignoring it was worse. What they pulled in was a human. Now, if you are unfamiliar with humans at this point in galactic history, congratulations. You have somehow managed to avoid the most aggressively unremarkable species in the known spiral. The Velthari, at the time of this particular story, were only vaguely aware of humanity's existence. They knew the humans had a planet, a wet, loud, chaotic planet that smelled faintly of something called rain, and that they had recently, in galactic terms, recently meaning within the last 300 years, developed rudimentary faster-than-light travel. They were considered a Class II emergent species, interesting enough to file a report about, not interesting enough to visit on purpose. The human they pulled from the wreckage of what had once been a scouting vessel was named Petyr Voss. He was, by human standards, unremarkable in almost every possible way. Medium height, brown hair, the kind of face you would forget while still looking at it. He wore a patched, grease-stained flight suit with a flag sewn on the shoulder, the blue and white symbol of the Terran Frontier Survey Corps, an organization whose budget, the Velthari would later learn, was roughly equivalent to what Orvan himself spent annually on administrative supplies. Petyr Voss was also, when they found him, dying. Not dramatically dying. Not the cinematic kind of dying where someone grabs your hand and says something poetic. The quiet, boring, deeply inconvenient kind of dying. The kind caused by 17 days without adequate food, severe dehydration, a fractured left arm that had been set by the human himself using materials from his own toolkit, and a core body temperature that the medical scanner described as alarmingly low, cross-reference mammalian thermal requirements. The medical officer, a younger Velthari named Setha, had never treated a human before. She had, in fact, never been within arm's reach of one. She stood over Petyr's prone form on the examination slab with the careful, slightly horrified expression of someone asked to defuse something they had only read about. "It's smaller than I expected," she said. "They usually are," said Orvan, who had also never seen one before and was absolutely bluffing. Setha ran the scanner again. "Nutritional deficit is severe. Whatever the vessel's emergency rations were, it appears he consumed the last of them roughly 4 days ago. He's been running on." She paused, squinting at the readout, water and what the scanner is calling trace carbohydrates. "What are trace carbohydrates?" "Crumbs," said the ship's interpreter, a willowy Velthari named Fen Karis who had studied 17 languages and still found humans baffling. "He's been eating crumbs." There was a silence on the medical deck. "For 4 days, Fen added, helpfully. Orvan looked at the human on the table. Petyr Voss looked back at him, barely through half-closed eyes, with the glassy, unfocused gaze of someone whose body had decided that blinking was a luxury. And then, and this was the part that nobody in that room forgot, the human smiled. Not a pained smile, not the smile of someone being brave in the face of hardship. A genuine, tired, slightly goofy smile, like he was mildly amused by the situation. "Hey," said Petyr Voss in a voice like gravel soaked in exhaustion. "Thanks for, catching me." Setha stared at him. "It is not able to talk." "It is talking," said Fen. "I am currently translating it talking. Shouldn't it be unconscious?" Fen looked at his translation device, then at the human, then back at the device. Apparently not. They fed him. That was the beginning of everything. Though none of them knew it at the time, they simply fed him because the alternative was having a dead alien on the medical deck. And that was, if anything, even more paperwork than the original retrieval. Sci-Fi synthesized something approximating human-compatible nutrition based on what the database had on file, which was not much. And Petyr ate it with the focused, methodical intensity of someone who had been thinking about food for 17 days and was not about to waste a single moment of the experience. He ate 3 full servings. Then he asked, politely, if there was any more. "Does it always consume at this rate?" Orvan asked. Fen consulted the database again. Apparently, this is actually moderate consumption for a post-starvation human. There's a note here from a Quellian research vessel that encountered humans and described their eating as, he paused, alarmingly purposeful. Alarmingly purposeful, Orvan repeated, watching Petyr work through a 4th serving with quiet, efficient determination. Yes, that seems right. Over the following 3 days, the time it took to reach the nearest Velthari way station where Petyr could theoretically arrange transport back toward human space, Orvan learned several things about humans that the database had not prepared him for. He learned that they were curious in an almost compulsive way. Petyr spent the first full day he was mobile, asking questions about every single system on the ship, not in an aggressive or intrusive way, but with the guileless, unstoppable interest of a creature that simply could not help wanting to understand how things worked. He learned that humans made sounds when they found things funny, short, sharp, involuntary sounds that Fen called laughing, which startled every Velthari in earshot the first several times it happened. He learned that Petyr Voss specifically had a habit of talking to himself while working through problems, a running quiet commentary that Fen translated as a mixture of technical analysis and highly personal opinions about the technical analysis. He also learned that Petyr was, beneath the easy manner and the terrible jokes and the compulsive curiosity, paying very close attention to everything. "He watches the crew," Setha told Orvan quietly on the 2nd day. "Not suspiciously, but he notices things. He noticed that Fen has been favoring his right side since the calibration accident yesterday. He asked me about it before I had filed the medical report." Orvan considered this. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him it was a minor musculature strain." He nodded and then, 2 hours later, left a cold compress at Fen's station. She paused. He didn't say anything about it, just left it there. Orvan looked across the bridge to where Petyr was currently leaning over a navigation console with the ship's junior cartographer, Velthari. The two of them pointing at things on a stellar map with what appeared to be genuine mutual enthusiasm. Velthari was 19 years old and had joined the survey fleet specifically because he found deep space cartography thrilling. He had not, in 4 months aboard, found anyone else who agreed. Petyr Voss apparently agreed. "What are they doing?" Orvan asked. "Comparing notes," said Fen from across the bridge. "Apparently the human survey corps has been mapping the Cassian corridor from the other direction. Some of their data points are different from ours." He paused, listening to his translation feed. "The human says the variance might indicate a gravitational anomaly that neither survey has officially logged. He seems very excited about this." Orvan watched the human and the junior cartographer lean simultaneously over the same section of the map, pointing at the same spot, talking over each other in 2 different languages with Fen frantically translating between them. Weld's crest markings, the Velthari equivalent of expressive eyebrows, were raised high in unmistakable interest. Said Orvan. They reached the way station on the morning of the 3rd day. Way Station Kareth 7 was not a glamorous facility. It was a refueling and administrative hub, functional and gray and smelling of processed recycled air, staffed by a rotating crew of bureaucrats who processed about 40 vessels a week and had long since stopped being interested in any of them. The station master, a heavy-set Velthari named Duro Pak, met them at the docking port with the expression of someone who had been told there was an unusual passenger and had not yet finished resenting the interruption. He looked at Petyr. Petyr looked back at him and raised a hand in what Fen had explained was a standard human greeting gesture. "Is it dangerous?" Duro asked. "It brought me a cold compress," said Fen. "So, no." Duro squinted. "Can it get back to its own space from here?" This turned out to be a problem. Human space, such as it was in this era, was several relay jumps beyond what the waystation's standard transport schedules covered. There was no human diplomatic presence at Kareth 7. Humans didn't have a diplomatic presence much of anywhere yet, and the standard process for returning a Class 2 species member to their point of origin involved filing with the Interstellar Welfare Coordinating Body, waiting for a response, and then waiting for a response to the response. The estimated timeline was something between 8 and 14 standard months. Petyr took this news sitting on a crate in the docking bay, with the quiet, calculating look of someone who was running options. He asked 2 questions: whether he could work to cover his berthing and food during the wait period, and whether station communications could send a signal in the direction of human space. Both questions were technically yes. "Why the signal?" Orvan asked. He hadn't left yet. He wasn't entirely sure why he hadn't left yet. Petyr looked up at him with that same easy, slightly lopsided expression. "To let them know where I am," he said, "and to let them know what happened." He paused. "And to say thank you, on behalf of, well, all of us, I suppose." Orvan made a sound that his species made when they were not sure how to respond to something. "It was standard procedure," he said. "The signal retrieval. We would have done the same for any distress call." "Sure," said Petyr. "But still," he looked at Orvan steadily. "Someone should say it." Orvan left. He filed his report. He described the retrieval, the condition of the human, the medical treatment, the transport complication, and the current status. He noted in the supplementary observations section, because he was thorough, if nothing else, that the human had demonstrated exceptional adaptability, unusual perceptiveness, and a social manner that crew members had responded to with what he could only describe as unexpected warmth. He did not mention the cold compress, but he thought about it. Petyr Voss settled into Kareth 7 the way water settles into anything, quietly, without announcement, filling the available space. Within a week he was helping in the maintenance bays, because it turned out that a Terran Frontier Survey Corps scout pilot knew a remarkable amount about keeping aging machinery running on inadequate resources. Within 2 weeks, 3 of the station's senior engineers were stopping by regularly to discuss problems with him. Within a month, Duro Pak, who had asked if it was dangerous, was having his morning meal brought to him by a human who had learned, somehow, that Duro's favorite blend was a specific tea analog that was technically not on the station's standard provision list and had to be specially ordered, which Petyr had done without being asked with his own first pay allocation. "I don't understand it," Duro told his deputy, staring at the tea. "Neither do I," said the deputy. "But yesterday it fixed the secondary coolant coupling that we've been rerouting around for 8 months. Why? It said it had an hour free, and the bypass was inefficient." Duro drank his tea. 14 weeks after Petyr Voss arrived at Kareth 7, a signal came back. Not a bureaucratic acknowledgement. Not a standard Class 2 species welfare response. A direct signal, on a frequency that made the communications officer come find Duro personally, because it was on a band that the station's system had flagged as a priority diplomatic channel, a band that, technically, only major spacefaring civilizations used. Duro looked at the signal origin coordinates. He looked at them again. He called Petyr. "This is in your direction," he asked, pointing at the coordinates. Petyr looked at the screen for exactly 2 seconds. "Yes," he said. "That's home. They are using a diplomatic priority channel. That channel is reserved for civilizations with a Class 4 or higher fleet designation." Duro stared at him. "Your species is Class 2. Petyr smiled. That same easy, slightly lopsided smile. "We were," he said. "When I left, the signal contained 3 things. The first was a message, short and formal, addressed to the administration of Waystation Kareth 7, identifying the sender as the Terran Diplomatic Advance Corps, an organization that, according to every database Duro frantically cross-referenced in the following 20 minutes, had not existed 4 months ago. The second was a set of approach coordinates and an estimated arrival window. The third was a list. Duro read the list. Then he read it again. Then he handed it to his deputy without a word and went to go stand by the viewport for a while. The list was titled, simply, Cargo Manifest, Vessel TFS Abundant Return. It was 4 pages long. "What is this?" the deputy asked, scrolling through it. "Everything," said Duro from the viewport. "That's not an answer. Read it." The deputy read it. He got to page 2, stopped, looked up, then kept reading. By page 3, he was making the Velthari equivalent of blinking rapidly, which was a subtle flickering of the second inner eyelid, the one that activated involuntarily during strong surprise. By page 4, he was simply standing very still. "They're bringing food," he said. "They're bringing 47 different categories of food," said Duro, including 11 variants I can't identify from the descriptions. "They're also bringing medical supplies, engineering components, a portable fabrication unit, seeds, who bring seeds, and something listed as cultural exchange materials, which I assume means whatever humans consider gifts." The deputy looked up. "For the station? For the station. For the fleet that retrieved the human. For the way station network." Duro finally turned from the viewport. "And they want nothing for it. I've read the diplomatic header 4 times. There is no trade request, no territorial negotiation, no resource claim." He paused. "They just said thank you." Petyr, when informed of all this, nodded in the mild, unsurprised way of someone whose mail had arrived on time. "You knew," said Duro. "I sent a message," said Petyr. "You sent a message saying you had been rescued and were safe, and where I was, and who helped me, and what the station was short of." He tilted his head slightly. "I might have mentioned that the secondary coolant coupling had been running on a bypass for 8 months." Duro stared at him for a long moment. "That was in the message you sent home. I like to be thorough. You told them the way station's supply gaps. I mentioned some areas where support might be appreciated, yes. Why?" Petyr looked at Duro with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read. Not evasive, not calculating, just settled, patient. Like a person explaining something that felt completely obvious to them and was trying to find the right words for an audience who had somehow missed the memo. "Because you helped me," he said. "That's how it works." The TFS Abundant Return arrived 6 days later, and Duro, who had been running this way station for 11 years and had greeted roughly 3,000 vessels in that time, was entirely unprepared for what came through the docking umbilical. The ship itself was not, from the outside, especially impressive. It was large, yes, significantly larger than what a Class 2 species was supposed to be capable of launching, which was a detail that had been quietly rattling around in Duro's head since the diplomatic signal, but it was not the size that caught him off guard. It was the crew. There were 22 of them. They came down the umbilical with the organized energy of a group that had spent a long time in transit and was very happy to have arrived somewhere. Their commander was a broad-shouldered woman named Zemina Calloway, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had spent decades looking at things calmly and had gotten very good at it. Behind her were engineers, diplomats, medical staff, a botanist named Suresh Patel, who was already looking at the station's corridor walls with the focused interest of someone assessing available growing surfaces, and a heavy-set man named Bogdan Felk, who was apparently a chef and who, within 4 minutes of coming aboard, had located the station's food processing unit, spent 30 seconds examining it, and made a sound of deeply personal offense. "When did this last have a full calibration?" Bogdan demanded of the nearest station tech. 3 years ago, maybe." 3 years, Bogdan repeated, in the tone of a doctor reading a very concerning test result. He rolled up his sleeve. "Okay. Where are your tools?" Zemina Calloway found Duro at the docking reception point and shook his hand, a human greeting gesture that Duro had been briefed on and still found slightly startling. and then presented him with a small sealed container that she said was from Petyr specifically, a blend of something called coffee that Petyr had apparently described in enough detail that it had been sourced, packaged, and brought across several relay jumps. Just for Duro. Duro held the container and said nothing for a moment. "He said you like your morning drink strong," said Ximena. "I do," said Duro. "He also said you fixed his arm." That was Cethea, our medical officer. "We brought her something too." Ximena smiled. He wrote individual notes for everyone. On the other side of the docking bay, Petyr and Ximena's first officer, a young man named Ozias Webb, were already deep in conversation, bent over a data tablet with Weld Ossian, who had, as it turned out, never stopped thinking about the gravitational anomaly, talking fast in 3 directions at once. Fen was translating with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone trying to conduct a symphony with 2 extra instruments. The unloading took 2 days. Duro had not fully understood the list until he watched it become physical objects moving through his station, crates and containers and carefully packed units arriving in steady, organized sequence, each one logged and cataloged by a human logistics coordinator named Vera Mostin, who had a tablet, a system, and absolutely no patience for inefficiency. She spoke to the station's cargo crew in a tone that was polite, clear, and entirely non-negotiable, and by the end of the first hour they were doing things her way because her way was, demonstrably, faster. The medical supplies alone were enough to restock the station's bay for the better part of 2 years. The engineering components included parts for 3 different systems that the station had been quietly nursing along on workarounds. The portable fabrication unit was, according to the station's senior engineer, at least a generation ahead of what the standard Velthari commercial market was currently offering, which was a sentence he said very quietly and then looked around to make sure nobody had heard. The seeds were Suresh's. He had decided, within about 6 hours of coming aboard, that the station had 3 corridors with sufficient ambient light for a passive hydroponic setup, and he had begun installing one with the polite, unstoppable energy of a person fulfilling a personal mission. When Duro asked him why he had brought seeds specifically, Suresh looked at him with mild surprise. "Because you're going to be out here for a long time," he said, "and fresh food is better for morale than processed rations." Petyr mentioned the crew rotation schedules. Long tours. He pressed a seed tray into a mounting bracket. "Something green helps." The formal exchange dinner happened on the 3rd evening. Bogdan had by that point not only fully recalibrated the station's food processor, but had also produced, from the cargo they had brought, a meal that involved 7 courses and had the entire station crew sitting in a silence of pure concentration for the first 2 of them. The 3rd course produced the involuntary second eyelid flicker in approximately half the people at the table, which Fen quietly told Ximena meant they were genuinely moved. "What is this?" asked the station's navigation chief, holding her spoon very still. "It's a stock reduction," said Bogdan, with the serene confidence of someone whose identity is completely tied to making people feel exactly like this. Based on a French technique, adapted for available ingredients. What is French? A region on our home planet, known for being very serious about food. The navigation chief took another spoonful. "They should be." Ximena gave the formal address. It was not long, and it was not flowery. She was not, Duro sensed, a person given to floweriness. She said that humanity had been trying to figure out its place among its neighbors for a long time, and that the Velthari survey fleet had done something that mattered more than they might know when they pulled one human out of the dark and kept him alive. She said that humanity had a tradition, old and stubborn and not going away anytime soon, that when someone helps you, you help back, that the help doesn't have to match exactly, it doesn't have to be proportional, it just has to be real. Petyr wrote to us about every person on this station, she said, by name. What you did, what you needed, who you were. She looked around the table. We came for all of you. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, but full. Duro looked at Petyr, who was sitting further down the table between Weld Ossian and Ozias Webb, apparently in the middle of a quiet argument about stellar cartography methodology, that both of them seemed to be enjoying enormously. Petyr glanced up, caught Duro's eye, and raised his cup slightly. That same easy smile, the abundant return stayed for 9 days in total, which was longer than originally planned, because Vera had identified 7 additional supply gaps while cataloging the station's inventory and had simply added them to the outgoing order roster without being asked, and because Suresh needed 2 extra days to finish the hydroponic installation, and because the gravitational anomaly turned out to be real and considerably more interesting than anyone had expected, and by the time the preliminary joint survey data had been sketched out, there was paperwork to file, and Ximena and Duro had somehow ended up co-signing a preliminary framework for an information-sharing arrangement that neither of their governments had specifically authorized, but that both of them felt quite good about. On the morning of the 9th day, Orvan Deathsolis arrived at Kareth 7. He had not planned to. He had been in the sector on a separate survey leg, and he had, technically, diverted his route by about 4 hours to stop in, which he explained to Duro as a standard administrative follow-up on the retrieved passenger case, which was technically true and also technically not the main reason. He found Petyr in the cargo bay with Vera and 2 of the station engineers, doing a final check on the hydroponic installation. Petyr saw him, straightened up, and walked over. "Commander," he said. "You look better," said Orvan. This was an understatement. The person in front of him bore essentially no resemblance to the gray, barely conscious figure on Seitha's examination slab 14 weeks ago, except for the face, which was the same face, currently showing that expression, that infuriatingly warm and unhurried expression. "I had good care," said Petyr. Orvan looked around the bay, at the crates still being moved, at Suresh's plants taking hold in their brackets along the corridor wall, at Bogdan, who was, incredibly, already teaching 2 of the station's mess staff something involving a technique he kept calling the fold. He looked at all of it for a long moment. "You did all this," Orvan said, and it was not quite a question. "My crew did all this because of a message you sent. Because of what your crew did," said Petyr gently. "I just described it accurately." Orvan was quiet for a moment. He had a report to file. He had observations to record, the unprecedented diplomatic response, the supply transfer, the survey framework, the hydroponic installation, all of it, everything that had grown from one retrieval signal in the middle of nowhere. He was already composing it in his head, the careful formal language of official documentation, and underneath it, something else, something that did not have official language, that he was going to have to figure out how to say anyway. "My crew," he said finally. "The ones who were there when we pulled you in. They have been asking about you." Petyr blinked. "Yeah?" "Saitha, Fen, Weld Ossian, though he has been in contact with your cartographer directly, I understand. Webb, yeah. Those 2 are going to solve half the Cassian mapping problems between them. I give them a month, and the others, they wanted to know how you were." Orvan paused. "I told them I would check." Petyr looked at him with an expression that Orvan could not entirely categorize, something that was partly amusement and partly something warmer and less easily named. "You diverted 4 hours to check on me," Petyr said. It was a standard follow-up. A pause. "Tell them I'm good," Petyr said. "Tell Seitha the arm is completely fine. Tell Fen that the translation package he sent with the ship is already being studied at the Core Linguistics Division, and they think it's the best cross-species phonemic mapping they've ever seen." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small sealed envelope. "And give Weld this. It's survey data from our side of the corridor, the sections he hasn't seen. He'll know what it's for." Orvan took the envelope. He looked at it. He looked at Petyr. "You had that ready," Orvan said. "I was hoping you'd come by." Orvan made the sound his species made when they were not sure how to respond to something, and then he made it again, and then, slowly, with the slightly confused expression of a being having a physical reaction they had not personally authorized, he made a sound that Fen, had Fen been present, would have translated as a laugh. It wasn't a big laugh. It was quiet, short, a little rusty from disuse, but it was real. "You are a very strange species," Orvan told him. Yeah, said Petyr. We get that a lot. Orvan left an hour later, envelope in his inner pocket, a container of Bogdan's coffee in his supply crate, and a note in his official report that would be read by Fleet Command 3 weeks later, flagged by 2 different analysts, forwarded to the Bureau of Interstellar Affairs, and ultimately placed in the founding documentation of what would eventually be known as the Cassian Accord, the first formal framework of relations between Velthari civilization and humanity. The note was in the supplementary observations section, because Orvan was thorough. It read, "Recommend elevation of human civilization to Class 4 designation, pending verification. Rationale, their technology is advancing faster than our models predicted. Their logistical capacity is considerable. Their diplomatic instinct is unexpectedly sophisticated." But the primary reason for this recommendation is something that does not fit easily into standard classification criteria. These beings pay attention. They remember. When you help them, they do not simply record the debt and calculate repayment. They return, and they bring more than you gave, and they know exactly what you needed without being told, because they were already watching. I do not know if this is cultural programming, evolutionary trait, or simple stubbornness. I am not certain it matters. I pulled one of them out of the dark. He came back with a ship full of light. I think we should be very careful going forward about what we do for them, not because they are dangerous, but because they are earnest, and the earnest ones always surprise you. Attached, preliminary joint survey data. Also attached, a recipe for something called coffee. I did not ask for the recipe, it was simply included. This is, I believe, what they are like.